if we don't, he wants us.
So as everybody's sitting down, logistically, I think you're all on right now. So
Yeah.
if you, just for example, as soon as you hit it, the light will come on, and that's how you're going to tell.
Are we there? Okay. All right, the committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Cultivating Diversity and Improving Retention Among Congressional Staff. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. One of the main ways in which we retain staff is by having it be 90 degrees in here. So my apologies to each of you. We'll be distributing fans to the entire audience. Today we're going to talk about what's really the backbone of this institution, and that's the congressional staff that work here. I think I speak for all of us on the dais and those yet to come when I say we couldn't do our jobs without the teams of people who work for us. Anytime I get a compliment where someone says, nice job on this or that, my response is always, I got a really good team, and I feel very lucky for that. They are dedicated public servants who are here because they want to do meaningful work, and they often choose careers on the Hill and in our district offices despite the long hours and occasional lack of job security, and since we work on a 2-year contract, and lower pay compared to what they could make in the executive branch or the private sector. We are, as an institution, very fortunate to attract such talented people and hardworking people. However, keeping them here is another story. Turnover rates for House staff are really high, with most of the positions in member offices turning over every 2 years or less. Of course, that isn't always a bad thing because a lot of staff leave one job on the Hill for a different job on the Hill. But even when taking into account all the movement between different jobs, the typical staffer on the, leaves the Hill after 4 or 5 years. And we hear that they leave because after time, the desire to do good and serve the public is outweighed by the need for a better work-life balance and the need to make more money to afford housing and support their families and put kids through college. And that puts Congress at a disadvantage compared not only to the private sector, but also to the executive branch, and that doesn't serve the interests of the American people. Congress needs to do more to not only attract the best talent, but to keep the best talent and attract individuals who represent the diverse backgrounds and views that exist across our country. How do we create a work environment that makes staff want to stay here instead of heading for the off-ramp? And how do we make sure we have a Congress that looks like like America? I thought it'd be a good idea to bring in the point person who handles human resources for the House staff so they could talk about what benefits are available to staff. Then I found out that that person does not exist. There literally is not an HR point of contact for House staff. But we're still going to talk about benefits today. We're going to look to hear about current trends in employee benefits and look at what Congress can do better. We're also going to look at what Congress can do to recruit and retain diverse staff that reflect America. The 116th Congress is the most racially and ethnically diverse Congress in history, and the congressional staff should represent the diversity of our constituents around the country. And I'm looking forward to hearing what thoughts and recommendations our witnesses and members of our committee have for improving staff retention and for fostering diversity and inclusion in the House, and I thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll now invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me commend you for your leadership and for making staff of this institution and diversity that we're going to discuss today a focus of this committee. And modernization doesn't just mean updating our technology and improving the legislative process, but it also means ensuring that the People's House invest and professionally develop a dynamic workforce that reflects those we represent and does that both not only in our committees and our offices, but also on the House floor as well. Those serving on this committee represent very unique districts. We have Northwest Washington State, Northwest Georgia here represented, and our constituents have different backgrounds and unique experiences, and those who want a career in public service, they're certainly no different. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today about how we can attract and retain a workforce comprised of different voices, different characteristics, experiences, and skills here in Congress. With unemployment now in our nation at lowest rate in 51 years, I'm also looking forward to discussing how this institution can compete with the private sector and hire and retain some of the most talented persons in our country and that ultimately help us serve the American people better. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. It's building on the work that this committee has already done, and we get to have a conversation now to learn a little bit more about best practices from those that have been helping to change the narrative and to set new trends to increasing opportunity nationwide. With that, Mr. Chairman, I have to yield back.
Thank you. I know Representative Cleaver expressed an interest in sharing some opening remarks, and I'm happy to recognize him for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member as well. I am extremely fascinated by the diversity of our nation, the heterogeneity of the U.S. Population. I am frustrated by the homogeneity in the upper ranks of our government, and to some degree even down to where we are now. And because I personally believe that there are at this moment in history only a few, only a few people who would intentionally work toward exclusion. But that leaves the people who are unconsciously excluding. And so that's the area that I think we can impact, and I'm looking forward to ways in which the panel can present that might help us deal in that realm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thanks very much. With that, I think we will, did anyone else have an opening comment they'd like to make? Okay. With that, we welcome the testimony of our three witnesses. First, Dr. Alexander Alonso is the Society for Human Resource Management's Chief Knowledge Officer. During his career, Dr. Alonso has worked with numerous subject matter experts worldwide with the aim of identifying performance standards, developing competency models, designing organizational assessments, and conducting job analyses. He's also served as a columnist analyzing major trends in the workforce for the Industrial Psychologist and HR Magazine. I'm a subscriber. Dr. Alonso received his doctorate in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Florida International University. Next up, is it Laureles Wood, is that right? Okay. Laureles Wood is the author of The Loudest Duck, a book that dives into the many aspects of diversity and explains how to ensure a fair and level playing field for anyone working his or her way up the ladder. She's a nationally recognized speaker, author, and advisor, and has contributed to leadership in the women's community for more than 20 years. Ms. Liz Wood is the Secretary General of the Council of Women World Leaders, which is composed of women presidents, prime ministers, and heads of government. It's the only organization in the world dedicated to women heads of state and government. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, a JD from the University of California, Davis School of Law. And then Dr. Kwesi Mitchell is principal in Deloitte's Consulting and Government and Public Services practice with over 15 years of experience. To date, he's served over 40 clients across Deloitte's government and commercial practices. As a leader, Dr. Mitchell is passionate about mentoring and developing the next generation of diverse leaders. Currently, he serves as the diversity and inclusion lead for Deloitte Consulting and has championed recruiting diverse talent through Deloitte's first ever inclusion hiring Blitz. He holds a PhD in organic chemistry, is that right? Inorganic chemistry. I'm sorry. I literally don't know what that means. But from Northwestern University, an MBA, I really don't know what that means. An MBA from Drexel University and a BA from Kalamazoo College. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And Dr. Alonso, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Alex Alonso, and I serve as the Chief Knowledge Officer at SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. As the voice of all things workers in the workplace, SHRM is shaping the way employers and employees thrive together by advancing workplace practices and maximizing human potential. As the Chief Knowledge Officer for SHRM, it is my job to examine and understand the issues faced by employees, employers, and HR professionals on a daily basis. I deeply appreciate Congress leading by example and examining how it can reform and improve its own employment practices, including benefits offerings. An important area that we've studied and that Congress must closely examine is the use of strategic benefits. HR departments and organizations invest significant resources in designing benefits packages to recruit new employees and to retain their top talent. In SHRM's most recent survey, 92% of employees indicated benefits play a role in ensuring their overall job satisfaction. The results also showed a strong correlation between benefits and retention. This underscores the importance of organizations and their need to plan their strategic benefits to maximize return on investment and competitive advantage. This is especially true in Congress. Congressional employees often face long hours, a high-stress environment, and lower pay than their private sector counterparts. Under these circumstances, benefits play a significant role in employee satisfaction and retention. A study by the Congressional Management Foundation and SHRM found 72% of congressional employees reported benefits influenced their decision to stay in their current positions. In today's labor market, benefits offerings set organizations apart when recruiting and retaining top talent. While benefit offerings are important to congressional staff, they have just simply not kept up with the pace of private sector benefits. Moreover, they have not met the needs of our diverse and modern workforce. Research shows improvements in the economic landscape, and increasing diversity are driving organizations to refine their benefits programs. For example, there are currently 5 generations in the workforce with increasing racial and ethnic diversity across the country. This diversity also shapes perspectives as far as workplace benefits, leading HR professionals to restructure benefit offerings to appeal to a more diverse workforce. Congress should examine Hill staff views on work and benefits as a result. In a tight labor market, workforce development has become a big driver in supporting employees who want to upskill and employers who seek to maintain global competitiveness. 87% of employers report offering professional development opportunities as a benefit, and 14% of organizations say they increased their investment in professional development offerings over the last year. More than 90% of organizations offer paid leave of some type to their employees, while 34% offer maternity leave and 30% offer paternity leave. Remote work continues to be one of the most popular benefits, and as a result, teleworking options of all types are on the rise. With heavy workloads, long unpredictable hours, and limited time for family and friends, alternative schedules could be an attractive option for congressional staff. A growing number of employers have begun to offer student loan repayment benefits to their employees. SHRM's annual benefit survey shows employer-provided student loan repayment has doubled since 2018. Some congressional offices currently offer student loan repayment. However, there is room for improvement. SHRM strongly supports employer-provided education assistance, including expanding the benefit to student loan repayment. Education assistance is an important tool for employers to attract the best employees and build an educated, diverse workforce, especially in a situation or a work environment such as this where you have the best of all talent. In addition, retirement plans and healthcare coverage remain the cornerstones of employer-provided benefits, which I discuss further in my written testimony. While benefits offerings are critical to securing top talent, it is equally important that Congress address inclusion and diversity when discussing a modern workforce. The 116th Congress is the most racially and ethnically diverse in American history, as the chairman has pointed out. Capitol Hill staff should reflect a diverse workforce representing its constituents around the country. The employment process for Capitol Hill is vastly different than the private sector. Congress should explore the implementation of a centralized talent management system, while also keeping an eye toward effective people manager development as an important part of a great culture. Mr. Chairman and Vice Chair Graves, thank you again for allowing me to share my experience and SHRM's views on the importance of benefits as well as inclusion and diversity in the workplace. Congress can lead by example by communicating the true value of benefits and inclusion and diversity. What happens in Washington, D.C. will in fact impact other workplaces, and we at SHRM truly believe that creating better workplace policies leads to better workplaces and, in turn, a better world. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ms. Liz Wood, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Gilmer, Vice Chairman Graves.
You may have to hit the button on your microphone.
They only worked through that 3 times with me.
That's all right. That's all right.
So, thank you, Chairman Gilmer.
You may have forgotten because the sweat
That's
shop.
it. Thank you.
Clouding all of my judgment. I forgot about inorganic chemistry. I mean, it's all very challenging.
So we're good.
Yeah. You can restart our clock. I was doing shtick here. Yeah.
Thank you. Very good. And distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for allowing me to testify. My name is Laureles Wood. I think we know diversity and inclusion are keys to better decision-making, effective policy, and innovation. We know also that homogeneity works only when problems are simple, communication is easy, and the environment is not changing. You must have heterogeneity if the problems are complex, the communication is not easy, and the environment is changing. You must have heterogeneity. And it's about the number of people who are diverse on your staffs, we know that, and tracking those numbers and hiring and retaining, advancing. But it's not just about that. It's not about what I call the Noah's Ark approach to diversity, which is, God, if we could only just get 2 of each in the ark, we'll have our diversity. but that's a problem, and I'll explain in a little bit. So we do know the value of diversity and inclusion, creativity, innovation, different perspectives, experiences, backgrounds, talents, ideas, cognitive diversity. Think about your congressional baseball team. You don't want all catchers on your team. Diversity and inclusion also avoids the risk of homogeneous thinking, also known as groupthink. It avoids the over-reliance on dominant group members' perspectives. It signals trust in institutions by representing a reflection of America and connecting to communities. Yes, it is about race and gender, but also about socioeconomics, disability, sexual orientation, identity, language, sports, religion, education background, family status, military status, language, nationality, and we could go on. Diversity and inclusion are strategic tools to ensure better solutions. But what are some of the challenges? I mentioned Noah's Ark. The problem with that is that if the giraffe in the ark is looking at the zebra and is looking at him and says, gosh, you're funny looking. How do you do anything with that stupid short neck of yours? That's a problem. Because we have unconscious beliefs and perspectives and preferences and associations and roles and archetypes about who people are. We also have the challenge of confirmation bias, which is whatever it is I believe, I will sort the incoming information to confirm that which I already believe. Yeah. So, for example, we know from research, if you have a non-Anglo name, you're going to have to send out 50% more resumes to get the same response as someone with an Anglo name. We also know that if you send the same resume out with a female name and a male name, you're going to get different responses for that. We also know that dominant groups are assumed to be competent until they show they're incompetent, and non-dominant groups are assumed to be incompetent until they prove they're competent. We know these things. We also have what I call the elephant and mouse theory about things, which is if you're the elephant in the room, what do you need to know about the mouse? Not much. If you're the mouse in the room, what do you need to know about the elephant? Everything. So by and large, dominant groups aren't necessarily as in tune with non-dominant groups as non-dominant groups are with dominant groups. We also know that like gravitates to like, and like avoids not like. Some organizations that I have worked with don't necessarily have an intake problem, but they all have an upgrade problem. So you may be getting diverse people into the organization, into your staffs, but they may or may not be getting into the senior staff positions. We also know that homogeneous groups don't come to better solutions, they just think they did. Heterogeneous groups come to better solutions, they just don't think they did, because diversity turns out to be a little more complex than homogeneity. And then there's the challenge of avoiding the illusion of inclusion, which is that just because you have some programs around diversity and inclusion, it doesn't necessarily mean your organization is fair. So some of the tools that I think are valuable, a central human resource and diversity effort, which can help overcome unconscious bias, create consistency in recruiting and developing and training, creating an Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which I know has happened, is a strong step. Pay interns to avoid socioeconomic exclusion, get referrals from minority groups, provide a clear route to advancement, understand why people leave and why they stay. Learn about other representative bodies' efforts on diversity through organizations like the Interparliamentary Union. Think about, I think you know, the Rooney Rule or the Mansfield Rule, which is law firms committing to considering at least 30% women, LGBTQ and minority lawyers for significant leader positions. Obviously, creating things like a resume bank and having transparent, widely available job postings is very important to attract different groups. And understand that certain words, when you are attracting people, don't necessarily work for others. So if you're looking for a highly competitive ninja super warrior, you may get a few people, but you may be excluding a few people also. Make sure voice voices are heard, and understand and use tools to create a level playing field. Understand what I call the power of the mirror, knowing what it is you can be by who it is you see. This is a brief aside. I do run a council of women heads of state and government. The 76 wants to know the number. And when I talked to President of Iceland, President Vigdis, she said after she'd been in office for 8 years, going around the country, and she noticed that for the children under 8, they all thought only a woman could be president of Iceland. And the boys had to ask if they could be president of Iceland because they had never seen it. So obviously, most importantly, having a strong and committed leadership. This is the #1 requirement. on the path to a more diverse and inclusive workplace. Thank you for letting me testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Mitchell, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and other members of the Select Committee. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share Deloitte's experience today. Again, my name is Kwesi Mitchell. I'm a principal with our Government and Public Services practice, and currently I serve as our Chief Inclusion Officer for our Deloitte Consulting practice. At Deloitte, we've been leaders in diversity and inclusion since the early 90s. We think of diversity as the different skills, backgrounds, attributes, and perspectives that we each bring to the table. For example, I'm one of 9 siblings, raised by a single mother and a family of factory workers. I was the first member of my family to obtain a PhD in inorganic chemistry and
Nailed it.
and become a principal at a global professional services firm. Ultimately, these aspects are substantially more complex than the descriptor African American male. Our employees and your staff members are similar, with different roles, hobbies, and affiliations that shape who they are and how they see the world. Inclusion is leveraging all of those things which make each of us unique in a way that encourages us to be authentic and know that we are valued. In our experience, based upon serving clients, there are 4 distinct areas that might help you in your efforts that I'd like to share today. Firstly, recruiting must be a top priority. We know that teams with diverse backgrounds and experiences are able to generate creative solutions for the most complex challenges that we face as a nation. And you must extend that to the way that you recruit as well. What we do internally, and one of our most successful efforts was alluded to earlier, and that was our Inclusion Blitz. And in that particular effort, we had diverse candidates of non-traditional backgrounds that were screened by others with non-traditional backgrounds so that they could obtain a view of their full potential unencumbered by potential bias. Secondly, we've established a market-leading approach to engaging our people, which we call inclusion councils. These councils are local office groups that bring together people from different parts of the business with different backgrounds and experience. The result has been a vibrant dialogue that's enabled our colleagues and professionals to learn more from each other, be exposed to new experiences and ways of thinking, and share practices on building inclusive cultures on a daily basis. This is important because this collaboration allows people in areas that are less diverse to mingle with those that are more diverse, share best practice, and create a common culture that benefits all. Thirdly, mentorship and sponsorship are key aspects to our culture and are critical for retaining a diverse workforce. Personally, in my first 2 weeks at the firm, I interacted with a partner who became a mentor, told me that he thought that I would be successful within the firm and that he was going to do everything within his power to help me achieve what I could potentially achieve. I've tried to pay that forward, and we've established a very robust mentorship and sponsorship program that just recently, one of my initial sponsors was recently promoted to managing director, which I'm incredibly proud of. But more so than anything else, it proves that the tactics that we put in place and the path that we're on will lead us to be successful and continue to be able to do so in the future. Lastly, we develop our people and coach our managers in a culture of trainings focused on unconscious bias. And really that is focused on designing programs, tips, tricks, guidance, such that people can create inclusive teams in such a way that they are allowing our staff to operate in a way that they are unencumbered by potential biases that may limit their full potential. It's absolutely critical for all managers going forward today and has become an industry standard, let alone a best practice. Now, many of these trends and approaches that I've described are broadly applicable for improving diversity and inclusion across many organizations. I would like to discuss, one thing that's particularly relevant to Congress. I find more and more that strong inclusive cultures also include an element of purpose and dedication to the greater good. In fact, purpose-driven work is one of the top factors that today's workforce is seeking. Few organizations have as strong of a purpose as Congress, and it's an outstanding foundation for all of your efforts going forward. It is important to note that when it comes to diversity and inclusion, there is no one-size-fits-all model. Much like each of your offices and the districts that you represent, every organization has unique characteristics that must be taken account. However, venues like today, where best practices are being shared are invaluable to advancing the goal of diversity and inclusion, and I'm happy to help in any way possible. Thank you, Chairman and Vice Chairman, for providing this opportunity to share our experiences, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thanks very much. Stuck the landing, right at 5 minutes. Well done. We're going to roll into questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I want to just ask you to put yourselves on this committee. We have to make recommendations to the broader body around whether we're talking about benefits or diversity and inclusion. Put yourselves in our shoes and give us some thoughts as to what you think we ought to be recommending to improve recruitment, retention, and diversity of staff in the United States House.
Well, I'll go ahead and start off and argue that the same thing I would argue with any employer. And from SHRM's perspective, we approach this as recommendations that we would make to any employer-provided benefit strategy or any strategy involving workforce development or anything that has to do with retention of top talent. We'd ask individuals to really survey what it is that congressional staffers want and what it is that they value. Our recommendation in general is that it is a good starting point when you actually get a general consensus around what it is that your workforce is looking for, whether it be benefits, whether it be looking for new diversity, new inclusion programs, what have you. I think the other thing that we'd recommend is really to take a data-driven approach when thinking about what it is that is the best solution given your philosophy around talent. And if your philosophy around talent is to retain top talent and to attract that top talent, then you have to build the systems that support that, whether it be through recruitment strategy or whether it be through recruitment tools or whether it be through talent management systems as a whole.
Others want to weigh in?
I would like to weigh in on that. And from the standpoint of a very tactical aspect of diversity, I would say one of the key things that we have found is, in particular, who screens resumes and recognizes different experiences. Personally, it's been interesting just watching how so much is lost when we have people who are screening resumes that have different backgrounds than the person who is actually applying for a position. So from a very tactical standpoint, having a more focused perspective on how resumes are screened and shared across different opportunities is absolutely key.
I would also add, in addition to what was being said there, is that when you do interviews with potential staff members, that the interviewers are diverse themselves, not, to ensure that you're getting a wider range of questions. With reference to job descriptions, I would recommend that you perhaps get some people here who have companies that do this kind of algorithm work that can help you think about how you create job descriptions, and so that they don't advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups. And then obviously to reaffirm what was said, making sure you have databases, making sure that you have metrics and accountability for all of your efforts.
Dr. Alonso, you mentioned in your written testimony and spoke briefly about employee benefits, including things like not coming into the office, maybe working remotely, or maternity and paternity leave. Can you talk about some other things that might fit under the category of creative benefits that we ought to be thinking about that might maybe not be budget busters, but might positively impact the ability of people to feel valued and stick around?
Absolutely. I think the number one benefit that we see that is actually something that we consider to be an attractor or something that causes someone to retain is professional development and the investment in professional development. When you're thinking about a highly skilled and a highly talented workforce, it's the opportunity to engage in a variety of different professional development opportunities, some that are more geared towards career rather than the actual benefits or rather than the actual business that one is in, really has a real impact in terms of making sure that you're retaining top talent. And so when I think specifically about your question, what I really point to is professional development opportunities, and some that are well outside the scope of what you might think, whether it be in data analytics, whether it be in computer programming and coding, whether it be in a variety of other settings or other skill sets.
I know I'm a little short on time to be able to ask another question, so why don't I move on to Vice Chair Graves for 5 minutes for him to ask questions. Much as I want to ask Dr. Mitchell about compounds that don't include carbon-hydrogen bonds. So, Vice Chair Graves.
You gotta love Google. Yeah. I wanted to just sort of take a second and maybe expand on an idea that Ms. Liswood brought up, and you referenced an HR department. You've recognized, I think all three of you have, that we're 435 unique operating entities with unique budgets, and when you're talking about staff retention, that also impacts those making hiring decisions. So you have maybe a person who is accustomed to hiring decisions and evaluating resumes in a certain way and creating a certain work environment within an office may change as well, and then you're going back through that process again. Maybe you could just help us understand, is that possible to have one unique HR department that assists all 435 offices? Is that possible in this institution? Or do we need to learn how to train or teach 435 unique entities how to do this? And so Ms. Liswood, you brought it up, maybe you want to start, and if each of you could comment on that, I'm really intrigued by that idea.
Well, I think certainly a centralized entity can assist in these 435 businesses that you have. In other words, they can be the ones who help identify the best practices. They can bring experts in to help. They can perhaps do diversity audits for your office to help you see what it is that you may need to think about. They could potentially help you think about what I mentioned, what pools you're fishing from, and to expand the number of pools. So I think you can get some consistency across the 435, and with the understanding that each office is going to have its own particular perspective on what it wants and what it needs, but to help ensure that you are not in doing unconscious bias kinds of things as we discussed, just to give you those tools to improve that which you're already trying to do.
Great, thank you. Dr. Mitchell, any?
And I would encourage you, when you think about that, and especially since the Rooney Rule was brought up as well, you can have an office that acts as a referee to provide guidance that is used individually across the entire body. Or, going back to a chemistry reference, you can have a body that acts as a catalyst to fundamentally change how everything is done. I think that starting as a referee is a good initial step forward that can provide some consistency and start to move you along that particular path to see how much additional change is needed. And that can be a lightweight solution that you put in place there.
Great. Any thoughts, Dr. Alonso?
Well, I'm an organizational psychologist by training, so my natural tendency is to say it depends. The answer is always it depends. However, what I will say is, in this case, I think it is exactly as my colleagues here have described, a possibility, as long as we consider that there is a need for really one thing, and that's to set a foundation for flexibility so that each of the 435 offices can really deliver the philosophy and the strategy as far as employment, recruitment, retention that they want to carry out or they'd like to execute. So when I think of this, I think about setting a foundational set of rules or roles, I should say, that relate specifically to a centralized HR function, but that only enable or allow or unlock the ability to unleash potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful, and I hope the committee thinks about this more because, in a political environment, all of us we attain this position through an election, and oftentimes when that happens, the persons that lead your office there have come from your campaign potentially and may not have much, if any, experience as it relates to establishing a new office that has a multi-million-dollar budget and up to 20 employees or so. And then there's the challenge, and if you have any thoughts on this, it would be helpful, is that you have your district office and staff, and you have your DC office staff too, that are all sometimes very different, obviously very different roles, but they come from different hiring pools as well. And could a single HR department that's centralized here be able to accomplish both of those tasks. Any thoughts on that? Have you given any thought to that yet, Ms. Wood?
Well, as I listen to you, I'm thinking, well, they could certainly be a resource for you to help you identify what organizations might be useful for you in your district, for example, to find more diverse candidates or to post for jobs. So I can see that as certainly a value for something like this centralized group. Yes, you have those kinds of disparities between DC and your particular. On the other hand, I would also encourage thinking about diversity as a much broader sense of what diversity is, because you are looking for who's going to give me the different perspectives I need, you know, whose worldview is different than my worldview, you know, who's going to ask questions that perhaps wouldn't get asked otherwise. And so that's part of the mix of who you want in your organization. And I think a centralized group can help you get to that goal.
Right. Well, thank you. I know the time's expired, but thanks for interjecting a really unique idea. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. My son is an actor, and the reason he's getting a lot of work now is the new rules governed by the Actors Guild. And the reason you see so much diversity in commercials is that they are not allowed now to select people for roles that are not primarily based on personality. In other words, you don't need to get anybody to play Michael Jordan to sell the underwear. I mean, nobody's going to do that. But if you need a man and a woman, they're not allowed to say, okay, we want one white man and a white woman. They just have to get two people, and that's what if they start doing otherwise, they're violating contracts. And so if you haven't noticed it, just watch the commercials that are coming up now. A few years ago, that would never have happened. The other thing that I would like for you to, because it connects, I've thought about an Office of Inclusion and Diversity, or Inclusion and Retention, under the auspices of House Administration. And they collect resumes of individuals from all over the country. And one thing you have to do, I'm a United Methodist pastor, so the civil rights laws allow for us to hire Methodists. I mean, they don't say you can't discriminate, so you got to hire an atheist. You know, you can hire Methodist if you're Catholic. You can hire Catholic. What you can't do is say I want a black Catholic or a Latino Episcopalian. So this office would have all of them, and you could, you know, obviously if you're a Democrat, you can say I want a Democratic legislative director. And this would be the central place where that would take place, race neutral, gender neutral. You ask, they send it out. Here are 10 people that fit what you have asked for. And the only thing that I haven't worked through in my mind is that most people would know a woman's name from a man's name. And we can pass some laws, everybody must be named George, but I really I'm interested in you know, tearing that up, repairing it, and suggesting something that you think might be helpful. Any of you? Yeah.
And I'm happy to start. I think the notion that you pulled together, that you've spoken of a centralized office that would hold resumes and be able to extend the reach of the candidates beyond specific offices like core contacts in their immediate network is definitely something that would be, seems reasonable. I have, in my experience, done both resume reviews that are blind, you know, without particular names, and also those with names. And more or less, when you have standard recruiters who have been trained in things such as unconscious bias, have not noticed substantial difference between the two. So that's just one piece that I would offer to you, is that that might be a step, but I think the training of the people who are interviewing and screening resumes and understanding the backgrounds may in fact be sufficient.
I would add that in terms of resume review and specifically in thinking about how you go about reviewing resumes, it is much more powerful not just to focus on unconscious bias training and frame of reference training, but also to focus on what it is that people managers and the people who are actually hiring managers make decisions around when reviewing resumes. So it's not enough to focus on the centralized screening of reviews. It's much more powerful to also focus on what those hiring managers are looking to review. In many cases, that is much more powerful than the initial screen itself.
I might also add that besides the blind resume technique, there's also now something known as bunching theory, which is if you bring a group of resumes together, you're more likely to appoint a disparate group of people versus just one resume at a time kind of thing. So bunching theory, I think, goes to exactly what you were talking about. It's also a training issue to make sure that when you're screening, you're not screening for cultural fit, because that's a term that can be used to exclude people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't help but notice we're spending a lot of time talking about recruiting talented staff and retaining talented staff. There's been no discussion about recruiting talented congressmen and retaining talented congressmen. And I say that only partially tongue-in-cheek, right? Where my question is give me a parallel to what it is that we do up here in our 435 jobs. I could be completely without talent and get elected. And I've got to go out and find a team. I've got to find a team not just that knows how to check the four corners of the box. I got to find a team that believes in me. And that's going to create a whole bunch of bias for who believes in me. And then I've got to find folks who have a different level of trust and commitment in that. Easy to find folks who believe in Deloitte. Hard to find somebody who believes in that new freshman congressman that wasn't supposed to win to begin with. 640 miles away in Washington, D.C. What's a parallel? Rather than asking you all to give me all the answers, who's got a similar situation to us in Congress and they're already doing it well today?
So I've actually given this some thought, Congressman Woodall, and the closest parallel that I can think of that comes from the private sector is actually that the healthcare industry, and especially the industry involved with physicians and residents in general, or residency programs in general. You have a unique situation that is quite similar in that you're talking about the top talent in their particular field. You're talking about individuals that have to pull together an office in many cases as far as private practice, whether it be within a healthcare system or outside a healthcare system. And they have to engage in entrepreneurship and leadership with almost no training in it whatsoever. And so when I think specifically about how they are going about that, much of what that industry is doing is looking specifically at how they build those types of training programs through a centralized system like the Association for American Medical Colleges and their efforts to really focus on how they train and build better physicians, but not just better physicians, better leaders. Okay. And so that's where I would turn to first if I was to think about it.
Okay. Yeah.
The only extension I'd say to that, because I completely agree, is that you can look into instances that have partnership structures, right? Yeah. At its core, if you have institutions that have partnership structures where you have people who have made partner based upon a set of skills who now must be leaders and business owners, it's analogous.
Now you've got me wondering if I go start looking at Deloitte partners one by one. I'll see a different group of young people who are attracted to be your mentee than folks attracted to that less ambitious partner down the hall from you. Tell me, thinking about diversity, if I look down the row here, I see a lot of ethnic diversity, I see gender diversity, I don't see a lot of age diversity. Gray hair is not a common practice here, particularly in personal offices. Do we, in the industry, are we ranking diversity? You talked about Noah's Ark, Ms. Liz Wood. We're just going to get to everybody here. Is there if I'm trying to do better, and I genuinely believe folks are trying to do better, is there a hierarchy? We'll do better with race first, Rob, and then do better with socioeconomics second, then do better with regions, and then do better with age. Is there a measuring stick for success?
I'll jump in here, Congressman Woodall. There is no actual measuring stick or ranking, if you will. I think what we've seen is there is a strong emphasis on compliance, and when thinking about compliance, there are certain characteristics that are regulated and require us to be compliant. I think what we see, though, is that as an industry, especially in private sector, what we're seeing is a great movement towards more than just visual diversity. In other words, where is the diversity that exists that isn't that easily, readily available visual diversity? And so we're seeing a lot of that, especially as it even relates to new technologies like artificial intelligence and biases that enter artificial intelligence.
Ms. Liz Wood said in her testimony, diversity and inclusion signal many things, including a desire to embrace America. I worry we're going to create a compliance culture as opposed to create a performance culture that shows that we're trying to embrace inclusion to reflect America. Let me ask the final question, and that's burnout is my biggest retention challenge. Folks give this job everything because they so believe in it. We talk about family medical leave. We talk about parental leave. We don't talk a lot about sabbatical leave. I can't sell that to my constituents back home, but that is my problem. I want people who give it everything, and then by definition need to take care of themselves more in ways that Deloitte might not ask that same thing of. Do I have an analogous burnout retention model that I can look to?
Well, certainly some industries do much the same thing. Let's say financial services industries or even the consulting firms. You know, you're working 24/7, if you will. And some organizations have developed these kinds of off-ramp, on-ramp kinds of approaches to it. The off-ramp, on-ramp, for example, for some organizations, they have developed what they call returnship programs, which are those mainly directed toward women who've taken family leave issues, but also for men who do this. So it allows them to step off, but stay connected with the organization, stay up and current with what's going on, but step off for a bit and then come back to the organization. So that might be a practice that might be of interest.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Chair, and thanks for being here. So let me talk about compensation, right? Because that's when I think a lot of people automatically assume. However, in this case, I think it really is an issue. This is a crazy expensive town. People start out low 30s. A medium one-bedroom apartment take that entire gross salary would cover a one-bedroom, not paying taxes, eating, doing anything else. When I first got elected, when I was campaigning, I came up here for a fundraiser for another colleague, and it was a young professional group that was there, about 100 people, and a couple group of people I was talking to, they explained to me how, well, everyone here makes more than a member of Congress, because they all worked on the outside. It was a fundraising sort of group, and that's a reality. We have a lot of outside groups that can hire people away at higher salaries. Salaries here for even our most senior folks are tied to our salaries. They can't exceed our salaries by rule. On the outside, those groups don't have that limits. This year we got a 1% MRA increase for our office accounts. Pretty hard to divide that up and make it work for people. I know there's a lot of other factors in retaining folks, and you've brought up a lot of those, but just raw compensation. Can we just talk about that a little bit and get a little idea of your thoughts?
I don't know if you all want to start. Certainly, our position is really that compensable factors need to be accounted for. And when we look at the science, what really stands out is fair evaluation of compensable factors. And so, in my mind, the natural recommendation that I would make to any employer when trying to be competitive is to think specifically about what are those compensable factors and how you counteract that. Now, total compensation is broader. It includes benefits. When you're thinking about this from an HR perspective, it doesn't just stop at true compensation or pay or wages. What I would argue is critical is having a fair assessment of what is compensable in some way and how those factors play a role, and match that specifically to the skill sets and the roles and responsibilities that one might have in their specific role. Whether or not that actually happens, and whether or not there's a true blue classification system that fits that, certainly that's something that a centralized HR function could take up.
Anyone else want to address the issue?
Just speaking frankly,
Yeah.
and this was at the end of my comments as well, just with respect to there's aspects of compensation that will always be there. And what I do and what we frequently do as an organization is talk about mission. And for example, I have a number of practitioners who work for me now who will in fact be leaving the firm to go work on campaigns. So it's less been compensation. There are people who have been willing to make those sacrifices because they believe in governance and they believe in what you do.
I think people, when you look at the research, yes, compensation is absolutely a criteria. I think you just can't avoid that. But in addition to that, you could have the greatest amount of compensation. You could be paying people an extraordinary amount of money. But if they're not seeing personal growth, you know, if they're not seeing, if they're seeing themselves being excluded, potentially, if they don't see stretch assignments being given to them, if they're not being mentored or sponsored, you get my point. Yeah. So people will leave even in the face of very good compensation. So I think it is a balance, it is a mix, it is a challenge. I don't think anyone's going to deny you that as a point, but I think there are other ingredients that can be put to play.
Okay. Yeah, we also give people crazy long hours too, so just an added benefit within the job. So often I think most people who seem to have an entry path into our offices come as being interns just because they get exposure. They meet people. Many people I talk to, that's how they started. But of course, it's been unpaid until now. Now we have a small amount, but it's a pittance is really what we have right now. So we're actually doing it based on financial need. We ask people to fill something out, and we're still underpaying them significantly. Can you just address that, since that does seem to be the most common intake facility, how we could maybe address that part of compensation?
Defer to you again. You're the expert in this area.
Again, I'd point to what it is that we want to compensate and how we go about compensating it and what is truly valued, right? We've talked a little bit about intrinsic motivators and what drives engagement versus what are extrinsic motivators. In my mind, I look specifically to compensation, what that starting compensation might be, and say, how do we offset that if it's not something that we're necessarily happy with, and find ways to really hit that motivational sweet spot. That's what I would.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Brooks.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I have several different categories I'd like to cover very quickly. Dr. Alonso, you spoke about a talent management system and our philosophy around a talent management system. Could you please give us an idea of what that might look like here, very briefly?
So when I think about talent management systems, what I'm looking at is how do we train or develop our resources, our human resources, based upon competency-based systems. What I'm referring to is how do we give them the skills that they need today, as well as the skills that they need in the future? How do we develop a centralized system so that there's learning, development, and people manager development across the board? And then specifically with people managers, how is it that we develop them so that they are able to lead from day one?
And is that something that you could see us doing in 435 different offices, or would that require some centralized place, it sounds like?
I could see a scenario where it would be centralized, but I could also see a scenario where it could be done at 435 different businesses, as long as you set one common core standard.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mitchell, we've heard, about the importance of benefits in recruiting and retraining staff, but I also know that we often focus on the student loan repayments and the student debt that is accumulating, and, challenges that many young people have in even going to college. Can you talk about any programs where the benefit of tuition payment upfront? Because I used to be at a community college system, and sometimes, or getting companies to invest in their employees, sometimes we try to get them to do the tuition up front rather than the benefit after, because the individuals can't get the funds to start with. Any comments or programs you know about with respect to tuition payment up front and then retention afterwards when you invest in that employee or student, and whether or not that's anything you can envision here?
A slight deviation from that, what is common in a number of distinct areas has been tuition reimbursement as people are taking their courses in and of themselves.
Right, reimbursement.
Which is relatively typical, but yes, that does involve people taking out loans, but they're able to pay those loans back pretty immediately depending upon what employers are doing. It's becoming more and more common with respect to consultancies. And in fact, it's becoming more and more common for consultancies to advance those payments further and further up front.
And have you found in whether SHRM or Dr. Is it working? Is it helping with, excellent staff retention?
I definitely believe that it's helping with retention, right? Because particularly you're allowing your workforce, as we talked about a few minutes ago, develop new skills and see a path for them going forward and feel the investment that you're making in them.
Is it helping with recruiting? Do you have an opinion, Dr. Alonso?
It's just not something that's common enough to really have a real beat on what the trend is. What I would say is there is definitely evidence from an anecdotal perspective or qualitative perspective that speaks to the fact that it is helping retention. It is serving as some measure of recruitment bonus, if you will. I do think that there's also some value as far as it relates for the employer in terms of being able to lock in reasonable approaches to retaining their top talent.
Dr. Liz, would I like to ask, or Ms. Liz, would I like to ask very briefly about mentoring programs? You may or may not know that here we have run through the Women's Congressional Policy Institute, and Girls Inc. Brought 21 girls this year. I participated in taking your daughters to work, and so Kaylee from Indianapolis came and sat with me in hearings and throughout the day, and she asked spectacular questions, and I think got excited. I said, she of course she would like to maybe be president of the United States one day, so this is Kaylee from Indianapolis. But can you talk to me a little bit about how these types of exposure mentoring programs and what more we could be doing? Only 21 girls came, and because Girls Inc. of Indianapolis paid, I don't know if they paid for her or if her parents or mother paid for her or father, but how do we get more young people to contemplate life here if they've not had the opportunity to come here?
Well, what you just gave was an extraordinary experience for these 21
Hope so.
young women.
She was amazing.
I'm sure she was. And what you did was give her the possibility of thinking of other things, of what she could potentially be, which she might not have had that. Right. Mentoring programs are extraordinarily important. I think that bringing them to scale, as you're describing,
Right.
is sometimes limited by resources. Nevertheless, you can encourage your local constituency groups to create more mentoring programs, perhaps giving your imprimatur in some way to them, so that within your own congressional district, you've got good, vibrant mentoring programs going on. I do want to make one small point around this in organizations. This is Herminia Ibarra's work out of INSEAD, where they have discovered for corporations that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. So just to put a fine point.
Would you like to quickly define that just for everyone, very briefly, even though my time is up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mentoring is providing the ideas, the interaction as you've been doing. Sponsoring is basically, I'm going to sign the check that says you should take, that I'm going to back you in a position. I'm going to be the one who endorses you to take that other position. I say we have to put Mary in there, and I will guarantee that Mary is going to be successful. So it's a guarantee program, if you will, and it's very different because mentoring is more like to not like, or potentially, and sponsoring is quite like to like.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thanks, Ms. Scanlon.
There we go. Thank you for holding this today, and thank you to our panel. For the past 15 years, I've been active in the movement to increase diversity and inclusion in the legal profession with the Philadelphia Bar Association, with the large law firm that I used to be at. So I'm trying to see what concepts we've been using there that might translate. One of the big ones was that leadership had to be fully on board, that if it was just talk or just words, they had to walk the walk. Dr. Mitchell, can you speak to your experience and how that might translate here?
I think that the statement that you made is unquestionably correct, right? And particularly when you think about millennials in the workforce, they sense absence of leadership or empty words very, very quickly and then immediately decide to do other things. What we've done internally, particularly from the standpoint of making sure that leadership walks the walk, is tie our personal performance metrics to different diversity and inclusion activities. focused on mentoring people who look different than or have different backgrounds than yourself, and a variety of other things. So to make sure that you are doing more than just that empty talk, I think when it comes to accountability, such as performance and evaluation, it becomes much, much more deliberate.
So that leads to my next question, which is, how do you measure success? What kind of metrics might we employ here? And I think I'm new, but I'm hearing that there's been a little bit of resistance to a lot of measuring. So what kind of metrics might we look at? I like the one you just mentioned, actually demonstrated mentoring with people who do not look like yourself or have different backgrounds.
Yep.
You have
Would you like to-
something?
So I would actually like to address this question in large part because I think, one, what Dr. Mitchell has cited is absolutely a valuable point, and the approach you've described is incontrovertible. The leadership has to be involved in the mission of inclusion and diversity. And in fact, one of the things that we at SHRM have seen is the rise of diversity officers and inclusion officers and offices as a whole. And we speak to, one of the things that we like to highlight is ultimately it's your executive leader and your executive leadership that actually drives diversity and inclusion. So when thinking about what it is that one should look for, it's that leader, that CEO, that president, who's really going to be your chief inclusion officer or your chief diversity officer. It doesn't rest with one office. Relegating it to one office just isn't effective. Now, to your question about metrics and what it is that you might expect to see, I look specifically not just at what kind of candidates you attract, but I would also recommend looking at what kind of usage rates there are around professional development. What is it that you're seeing that is a usage rate based upon various diversity characteristics that make it clear that you have an inclusive environment and that people are using all the professional development available to them?
Okay.
If I could add.
Yeah, sure.
Congresswoman. Obviously, top leadership is most important around this, and they have to actually behave. They have to, they can't just say that they're for diversity, and then you look at their direct reports, and you see something that doesn't look like that. They also need to ensure that their team, that their staff also is diverse, so going down the organizational hierarchy. I think it's also important for senior leaderships to ask the right questions, the kind of the if not, why not questions. That, okay, I didn't see any women on this slate as an example. Why not? Come back to me when you have a more diverse slate. I also think it's important for the senior leadership and the top leaders to keep on top of what is the current research around diversity and inclusion and say, does this apply to our organization? I might give you one example around that, some research around performance evaluations done for 250 companies. 65% of senior women's performance evaluations had some negative comment about their communication style, sharp elbows, whatever. 2% of the men's communication styles were evaluated in that way. Now, what I would say to the CEO, if it had that information, I want to know what my company looks like with that kind of data. Are we better than that? Are we worse than that? So having a very curious CEO, I think, is extraordinarily important in this area.
Of course, we've got an issue where we have multiple CEOs. But I guess I would urge that, yes, each office, but then some kind of leadership above that, looking at that, which leads me to another tactic that seemed to work pretty well in the law firm environment that might be replicable, which is we might have some competitive individuals here. So if we have recognition for people who are doing the right thing, does that help?
We've certainly found that appreciation and recognition as a whole are a valuable tool when trying to create an inclusive culture.
Or the reverse being shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also to make it clear to particular or potential staff members where they would like to go and who they would like to work with. We've seen that to be very, very key as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks. I'm going to invite any of the members of the committee who have more questions to dive in. I have got a few. So Congress is a little bit unique than a lot of agencies of the federal government that use the GS scale, right? Where you have a specific job title with a certain job description. Someone may be able to either work their way up into jobs that have different expectations, and then also from a tenure standpoint, pay and benefits often improve over time. Congress doesn't do that. I wanted to get your reaction to whether that's a good thing, bad thing, just a thing. Something we should be looking at, not looking at?
It all depends on how you want to use or employ that particular type of system. I would argue that, and when I advise employers or when I speak to federal agencies specifically about this particular topic, whether it be formerly back in the late 2000s or early 2000s, it was the NSPS system, and should we compensate based upon pay for performance or some factors like that, I think it all speaks to what is your intended goal and your intended purpose. If you think it will in fact help a retention issue or support a retention issue or help someone be a better manager of congressional staff as they cycle in and out, certainly that is a reason to follow that. But an estimation one way or the other as to where it fits all depends on what the intended purpose really is.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that, or not really? Okay. I wanted to get your impression on the idea of an HR department, or at least an HR kind of lead point of contact within the Congress. Your thoughts on that and the types, it seems like the types of functions that could be done should such an office exist would be things like maintaining a resume bank and sharing best practices on everything, from diversity to retention with the 435 independent contractors who work here. Or even, Mr. Hoyer, when he came on Member Day, testified around, offering certifications or compliance certificates on everything from ADA accessibility to, Gold Star for being a veterans hiring office or what have you, to being a central repository for collecting some of this information around how we're doing, right? I mean, I've been struck by it's hard to actually figure out how to make improvements when we don't have great information on benchmarks. Thoughts on any of what I just said? Reactions? What am I missing? What's good, bad, ugly? And go ahead, Ms. Scanlon.
Could I add on to that? We had been toying with the idea of having some kind of toolkit available to members. So with best practices, but here's where you could go, and having a package to hand to people, if you can add that into the mix.
I wouldn't be a good consultant if I wasn't supportive of process that is centralized, that also comes with toolkits, right? But I think more so than anything else, what you're talking about is being able to do some of these things at scale and share best practices, which I think is really key to make forward progress.
And I think for many organizations, let's pretend that was an organization that had 435 divisions to it. They would potentially look at each of the divisions and their success or their failure and say, okay, why is this particular entity doing so well? What is it that we can learn from to bring the others up? Obviously you can look at why the ones aren't doing well and do some audits around that. But I think one of the benefits of having so many different business units is that you have this opportunity. Yes, giving people a toolkit, but who's implementing it and who's implementing it well? And that's what a central group could help you do.
At the end of the day, I think a central group would be someone that could help unleash potential for the various 435 offices. I don't think of them as someone who's going to regulate or mandate or anything like that, but I think of them as someone who will help track the trends, help you assess how well you're doing, and at the same time help you institute a culture that you're seeking, help have better people managers, have people managers who can have difficult conversations, which are really the hardest part when dealing with employees and employee relations. I think it's really a resource to the 435 offices as we're describing it.
Very good. Ms. Brooks, you had?
Dr. Alonso started out mentioning, and I found it interesting, you mentioned 5 generations in the workplace. Could you quickly, just kind of for the record, at this point in time, what are those 5 generations, very briefly, and what are the challenges we ought to be thinking about, because we have multi-generations of members, but I think it's less so in the workforce, quite frankly, for the most part. So, and what is it that we either can or could be recommending as a body as to how we deal with that?
So I do not pretend to be a generational researcher by any stretch, but I will speak to what we know from Census Bureau data as well as from work done through the National Academy of Sciences. And specifically, when we think about this, there's about 1% of the workforce that consists of traditionalists, so people who were the greatest generation, if you were to think of them. Then you've got baby boomers who are now moving out, and somewhere between 6 to 7% of the workforce. Gen Xers make up about
Wait, it's how much?
6 to 7%.
That's
by
all?
25, yep.
Some of us are working too hard still. Okay, baby boomers, 6, 7. Okay,
And
what?
again,
Really?
And I don't pretend to be a
Only
generational
6 to
researcher.
7?
6 to 7.
Okay,
Then you got about 30% of the workforce that's Gen X. and another
Okay.
32% that's Gen Z, millennials.
okay.
And then you've got the rest coming up, bringing up the rear, which is your Gen Z or your I generation, if you will. And by I generation, I mean those that were born with an iPhone in their hand.
Okay.
What we see is that
There's some of them here, few. Yeah.
I have a few at home. So
Okay.
with that in mind, what we see is really there's an opportunity to customize the employment experience for those individuals. It's not about dealing with differences amongst the generations, but rather how do you customize the employment experience so that you foster better communication depending upon the generational realities, if you will. I think the other piece that we see HR professionals as a whole really focusing on is how do we tailor what it is that we offer, from whether it be benefits, compensation, what have you, jobs, to really fit the skill sets that best suit our diverse workforce.
Thank you, and I would assume there are plenty of, anyone else want to comment or know more that you'd like to share about, the generations piece of HR?
If I could just share the sort of unconscious bias part around that.
Okay.
It's what the, most senior people really think about the more junior people. Or what the more junior people really think about the more senior people. And to your point, Congressman Woodall, what do people who of a certain age think about other people, and vice versa. And that will permeate into how you interview people, who the candidates are that you potentially choose, is based on the unconscious beliefs about who people are in the different generations. So you can have the different generations, but if I think this particular generation is entitled or impatient, and this generation doesn't know anything about technology, I'm going to embed those things in my own head, and then I'm going to distinguish how I think about people. So that's a little bit of more of a psychological element to this generational issue.
Anything, Dr. Mitchell?
No.
Okay. You don't want to, I think that's actually a bigger issue here than we all might appreciate and want to admit. I think it is in every workplace, but I didn't realize we were up to 5. So thank you for sharing, and I'm in that upper, and that's why I'm slowing down in 18 months. No, I'm going to join. No, so thank you. Yield back.
Very good. Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick questions. Thinking about Dr. Alonso's comment about folks gear themselves towards compliance. I have a real fear where it's easy for us to try to start checking boxes around here because we all want to be successful. Has anybody modeled the we're not going to check 5 boxes, but we want you to get 2 out of 3 here and 2 out of 3 here, 2 out of 3 here. I'm thinking about married, single. You're going to have different opinions on tax policy than you would otherwise. Urban, rural, you're going to have different opinions. Southeast, northwest, you're going to have different opinions. Military service, no military service, single parent, dual parent family. The list is infinite, and I need all of those opinions. I don't think of the folks in my staff necessarily as the deliverers of those opinions. I'm going to call experts at the CDC for healthcare information. I'm going to call experts at the Census Bureau for demographic information. But as it comes to compiling my staff, is there a checklist that isn't a checklist, but a try to get 3 out of 10 that recognizes if we start listing diversity that list goes on for forever? If you're going back to my yardstick question, if I want to do a good job, but I can't tell how to measure success.
I have not seen a checklist or a yardstick that would get exactly what you're targeting, because so much of it is dependent upon what the ultimate outcomes are that you're driving towards. And in many respects, I think that pushing towards cognitive diversity is much more critical, rather than trying to check that I have a black male on the staff team, on your staff. So I do think that there are nuances there. depending upon your outcome. But I don't think, in my experience, that I've seen an overabundance of compliance culture in the organizations that I've worked with.
Is neurodiversity the same as cognitive diversity? In your testimony, Ms. Liz, what is neurodiversity?
Neurodiversity, and please correct me if I'm wrong with the PhDs on both sides of me here, is more like, are you an introvert, are you an extrovert? Are you know, what side of the brain do you know, are you a rational thinker, a emotive thinker, that kind of thing, versus the cognitive diversity, which Dr. Mitchell is referencing, which is what's people's worldview? What are they bringing to you? That, so you don't make a decision that missed out on a huge issue that you should have known about.
And what I'd add to that is actually diversity around what your skill sets are and experience. So for instance, for many years we've seen research around biodata as an example, or biographical data that sets apart different information, experiences that individuals have had that helps enhance your diversity or your inclusion. That's not to say that we're looking for specifically individuals that are Black from a specific region within the nation, but rather somebody who's got an experience as law enforcement, or someone who's got an experience as having been a pilot, let's say, or something like that. That leads to different experiences and also leads to a different diversity, if you will.
Thinking about retention, we are of two minds here. Are our staff exceptional and different, or our staff just like every other federal employee? 1995, we passed the Congressional Accountability Act to try to bring more rules to bear here, but in 2010, we kicked all the federal employees, all the congressional employees out of the federal healthcare system and said, no, you have to go into a separate healthcare system because you happen to work for Congress. Is there a consensus as it comes to retention, whether mimicking what the rest of the federal government does and being what word did you use earlier, Dr. Mitchell, about a rigorous, not top down, but you said as a consultant, I have to support a centralized process. Thank you. Well, like, you know, OPM has such a centralized process, and I could certainly turn to them. My natural bias is to say, no, we're doing something special here. That's why we're Article 1 and not Article 2, and so we're going to have a completely different set of rules here to achieve our ends. Is it obvious whether replicating what the rest of the federal government does helps with retention versus providing for some exclusivity on Capitol Hill?
I would not say that there is consensus. I would argue that it has to suit what your strategic objectives are and what it is that you're looking for as an organization and as the House. Okay. So.
What is it? So right now the situation in terms of employee health care is they're all required to be on the DC exchange, including the staff in our district offices, which, you know, if you're from Washington State, finding a provider that's covered under the DC exchange is challenging. It may be challenging in Georgia too. Do you have a perspective on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I'll wade into this one a little bit. And so what I would argue is the same, keeping in mind that my experience is predominantly private sector. What I'd argue is that every employer, whomever they may be, whether it be a collection of 435 employers or a broader organization or collection of those, what I'd argue is you really need to look at what it is that best suits the needs of your employees. So it starts with actually surveying congressional staff to see how you build the best possible health package for them. When thinking specifically about what we recommend to private sector employers, that's where we begin, and then we start to ask them to consider what are the best brokered benefits that exist for them and what are the best solutions given their strategic spending in this area and what it is that they have allotted to them as an organization from a financial resource perspective.
So just spitballing here, for the sake of discussion, you know, giving options, right? Like, if you come work in a congressional office, you have the option of being on the federal employee health plan that every other federal employee is on, or the DC exchange, because there may be some districts where they don't have enough providers that are covered under the Georgia exchange, or there may not be a Georgia exchange, or an option of being on the state exchange. So that type of situation where you could give them the option. Does that, any reaction to that? Does that seem, that sounds reasonable, or you're bonkers, Kilmer, or?
I would never say that you're bonkers.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
But I will tell you that that's beyond my area of expertise, and I definitely could connect with your staff on that.
Okay.
I would say that it's very important to know why people leave, to truly know why people leave, because some of the research shows that when people leave, they say, I'm going to go for a higher paying job. Then when they actually interview people afterwards, 1/3 left for a higher paying job, 1/3 left for the same paying job, and 1/3 left for a lower paying job. So, you know, probing to find out why people leave, because it may or may not be an option problem that you're dealing with, or in fact, it may be. But unless you really do that and create those kinds of exit interviews that allow you to really understand the dynamics of what's going on, I think you're spitballing, to use your term, sir.
Yeah.
Well, if you all would think of our committee, if you find somebody with this, this parallel, we didn't put our staff on the DC Exchange because we were trying to figure out what was best for our staff. We put our staff on the DC Exchange because we were trying to figure out what was best for us politically, and whatever calculation we made that calculation. It's great to sit and listen to you all talk about how we could do better for our staff, if only that was our goal. Knowing that it really is our goal in our heart, even if we can't live that out politically, if you stumble across those ideas that would get us the most bang for the least amount of political buck, yes, I'm listening to Derek, and I'm willing to say, Kilmer, you're bonkers, Dr. Mitchell, because my constituents at home don't have multiple health care choices. They're angry that they only have one choice on the exchange, and now I'm going to go say, you know what, but these congressional staffers, they need all the choices on the DC Exchange and all the choices on the FEHBP. It's great staff management. It's lousy reelection politics. I don't want our staff to be disadvantaged, as they in fact are, because of election politics. So if you stumble across those things that get us the most bang for our staff with the least amount of constituent ire, and I just expect that you would have a view on that, and you'll come across those things. I would value that submission at a later date. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Mr. Cleaver.
My final comment. You've been very helpful to me, but we have perhaps the most unique situation in the country because, you know, the staff salaries are connected indispensably to ours. The American public hate us. And so until we can figure out a way to make the American public, at a minimum, just say we're okay, or tolerate, that's a good word, tolerate us, then there's always going to be any hesitation to raise the congressional salaries, which means that the staff members are stuck. The federal courts were attached, the judges, federal judges in this country had their salaries attached to us. They filed suit. I warned everybody, some of my close friends, that they were going to win the suit, primarily because judges are the judges. And they did. So they were decoupled. And so they get 15 years back salary, court ordered, and salary set 25% higher than ours. And so maybe the staff members need to sue us. I don't, you know, I think, I mean, we have a weird situation, but the reality is that we've got to figure out a way for Congress to function, you can't fix this, but to gain the respect of the American public. And maybe we quit talking about each other. I mean, you know, maybe we ought to quit saying nasty things. I don't know. That may be going too far. I just think that the bottom line in all of this, none of this is going to be helpful if the American public hates us. Editorial.
You can always end it with, don't you agree? And then it's a question, but very good. Seeing no other questions, I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for the inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Feel free to go cool down.